Are people able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So how many of you have worked with web workers? And probably like if you people have used Comlink, probably you'll be able to relate a lot. But we'll also go through very basics, like what web worker is, how it works, and then we will see how the Comlink works internally. So we know, like we understand what all things are there. And feel free to interrupt in between, interrupt in the sense like feel free to ask questions. So the agenda of this meetup is to learn, share, to have shared learning. And it's not like I'll be just speaking. If you have something to share, please do share in between as well. So feel free to interrupt, feel free to ask questions in between. So while we start, just to give a little bit overview of what a web worker is. So like everyone knows that JavaScript is a single threaded language. All thing you run, whether it's a JavaScript execution or if the browser is doing any layout, painting, all the animations, everything run on a single thread. And it manages everything through something called callback queue, which it picks whatever thing is on top of that callback queue, execute it, and then move to the next queue. But sometime you have to do some processing heavy work, and like most of the time people don't care. It might not be like a interaction might not take a lot of time, but let's say you are doing some mathematical work, or if you are doing some image processing type of thing, or some canvas related calculation, or could be anything. If you are doing any front end heavy stuff, there could be a need where if you are doing some interaction, you can feel your like full application to be a little bit lagging behind, just because like your JavaScript is busy doing things. So browser provide a way to handle that by offloading your work in another thread. So it's a single threaded language, but internally, it launches a different processes for API handling and for IO, for rendering, for some of the pixel calculation and stuff and all of those things. So internally, it does inter-process communication. So same thing, now they give on a user capability that you can launch a new process, new thread, and you can do some work there and get back the information, right? So if you see, it looks very simple. You initialize a worker. Worker is basically that the JavaScript which runs on another thread. And then once you have initialized the worker, you basically communicate through that process through post message and on message. And post message is basically saying like, okay, to that process, post some message, and in worker thread or your main thread, you will receive that message through on message handler. You can also use add event listener here. But yeah, it sends on like message event on your process. So one example of this is like in your main.js, you would instantiate a new worker. You listen for any message coming, incoming messages, and you post some message. And same in the worker, you will listen for whatever coming from main thread. And once you receive that, you will send the message back. I have one small example running, so I can probably show that as well. So I've created one example app where there are different examples. Let's look the basic work example, right? So this is a very simple usage of a worker file. So I've defined one worker file in public folder, just that so that it is available on the same domain. So one constraint with the worker is that it has to be on the same domain when you are executing it. So yeah, like once you initialize the worker, then like on a click, you can send some post message and you'll receive the message back from it. So here, if you see the message, you will see like from your main thread, you are sending some message, and in your worker, you are just logging that message and again posting back like something back to the main thread. So this looks fine for this small example, but it becomes a little bit complicated when you're like the number of messages changes, or like if you have some complex structure to share. One thing before we move on that, basically like how the post message works is pattern where so in XHR, in like when you are communicating to server, you must be familiar with like a request response object, right? Here there is no request response object. Here it's mostly like you are sending some message. Now in XHR, basically you are serializing your data, and you are sending that data. Similarly, something happens here as well, but it's not serializing. So it applies a different algorithm called structure cloning. And structure cloning is basically like whatever object you are trying to pass from here. So you don't have to pass a string. You can pass any object as well. You can pass an array, you can pass an object, you can pass a map. So there are different things which can be structure cloned. You can pass all of them. And how it works is like it basically clones, like it's deeply clones that particular object, because like a same reference can't be shared from one process to another process, right? If two processes are trying to control the same reference, then thing will get messy. Like both are trying to touch same reference, and you don't know like from where something has been updated. So that's why like it creates a copy instead of passing the same object reference. So that is basically structure cloning, and it's more than JSON stringify and JSON parts. Like people initially, like when structure cloning was not there, so it was mostly getting passed as a string, serializable string. But now after the structure cloning is there, like everything is cloned in a way, like and in when you do JSON stringify, it can't handle the circular objects as well. So structure cloning can handle those things, and it also maintain the type of objects. Let's say you can pass maps and sets, all of those things. In stringify, like a JSON stringify, you can't do that. So it's a you can think it as a more advanced version of a JSON stringify and JSON parts. So you're serializing here and you are deserializing here. So kind of like browser internally do some serialization, which requires structure cloning, and then there it does deserialization, and basically extracting the data back. And how it works is basically like whatever you're posting message here in your worker file, it comes under e.data, and for Chrome, Chrome, Safari, and like most of the browser basically does the deserialization when you actually access the data. It will not deserialize until you not access the data. In Firefox, I think it was a different case, but not sure if I had like it used to deserialize while calling this on message handler, before calling this message on message handler, but now I think it has changed to the data access. Now there is a way, like though structure cloning supports a lot of things, sometimes it's not that fast. Like if you have to transfer a big object, it might not be very fast. And so there is something called transferable objects, and transferable objects are basically like so it looks something like this. let's say you have a array buffer, and you can array buffer. So anything you can think as a data stream. So there are multiple things which can be transferred. One is like a array buffers, unit 8 array or unit 32 arrays. And then there are like a ports, message channel ports, and all of those things can be transferred from one. And how the transferable object work essentially is basically instead of doing a structured cloning, it kind of move the reference, it transferred the reference of an object from one process to another process. So once it is transferred, the object will no longer be available on your main thread. So let's say if I'm doing post message like this, now I can't access array buffer here because like it is transferred to the worker thread. Worker thread or from worker thread to main thread. So yeah, like a transferable objects are, you can think of a reference which is completely going from one realm to another realm, and you don't have access to it on any other realm. This is very good for things like if you're doing let's say canvas based rendering, or if you have a blob data. Or let's say one simple example would be on a file, like you have a file API, you are reading some file, and you have a the file reader API, right? So from file reader API, you get the buffer, and then you might want to process that file. So instead of converting it into a string or any other format, you just pass that buffer to a worker, and in the worker, you do all the manipulation, you send the output back. So you don't have to pay the cost of converting that back to a string and then passing it to worker, which will cause structure cloning. So these are fast. By the way, like even structure cloning is not that slow. Like we think it is slow, but there is a very good article by Surma on this, that it depends on the depth. Like if you have an object and it has a depth, it has a breadth. So it depends on the breadth and depth. And also it depends on the string size. Like if you have a 3-character string or like a total. You can think of like if you JSON stringify this thing, whatever the length is, based on that, the time for structure cloning will be different. So they have a benchmark, and generally like until you're sending something like a 10 MB data, you don't have to think a lot. Like mostly you'll be sending under 1 MB or under 100 KB. But if you are passing image data, probably those are the places where you might want transferable objects, because you already have the buffer and you can just pass those buffer, and there is no like a zero time passing from one realm to another realm. So that's transferable objects, and the pattern for that is basically like you pass the actual object, and you pass you define what is the buffer, and based on this, it actually does the transferring. If you don't pass this, if you just pass something like this, then it will try to structure clone your array buffer as well. So the second parameter is required there. Any questions so far on web worker and the like messaging part of it? Feel free to unmute and just ask. Okay. Let me go back here. So one problem I said, right? So one problem with web worker is basically like you have a post message, on message. So basically receiving and sending part of it, they are not like co-located, and can also happen out of order. To see an example, Let me math worker example. Okay, yeah. So basically, here what we have done, we have initialized one worker, and this is like a pattern for doing it on Webpack 5. In Webpack 4, you need Webpack loader, but yeah, like in Webpack 5, you can load a worker in this way. So ignore this part, ignore all of this part. But yeah, basically what I'm trying to show here is that the way you are sending a post message and then the way you receive it, they are not co-located. And if you have multiple operations happening on your, like different type of operations happening in your worker file, then you have to put all of this like a switch cases, if else, all of those things. And in worker file also, you have to do something similar, like you have to do on message, and based on on message, you do like based on type. You can follow any format. I'm just giving an example here. So you process things, right? So this become a little bit meshy when you have a different communications happening in your web worker. Just a moment. Yeah. So yeah, that's a problem with worker. Like it becomes very hard to manage code once the scope of your worker starts increasing. For simple, it's fine, but it grows. Okay. Is there limit of number of workers we can use? I'm not sure on the limit of workers, but I don't think there is any specific numbers. At least I don't know of any such limits. Need to check. Okay. Now, just to give an example of for that thing as well. So yeah, like you're sending an object and a type, all of those things, right? To solve this, there is one common pattern where you can convert this thing to a promise-based pattern. So instead of calling it at one place and then receiving the message at another place, and this can create out of order thing as well, right? Let's say I'm doing some async thing inside my function. Let me do this. Set timeout. And I'll just do okay. Now, if I do multiple of this, it's not necessary that the response would come in same order how I've clicked it. So yeah, like it can become out of order as well, because if anything asynchronous happening inside your worker file, it will block that. Actually, one thing I forgot to mention, even though there is a thread, there is a different thread running, but let's say if you are triggering multiple messages, if it is not a set timeout, if I'm just doing this thing, and if my, let's say, prime number function is taking a lot of time, so until the previous function is executed, the other messages will be queued, because like it works in the same a callback queue pattern, where here also there is a single thread, and a single thread can process only one JavaScript execution at a time. So if there is any pending messages which are there, it will queue until you're like a previous until your JavaScript is free. So it works in the same callback pattern there as well. So that's there. So to convert that into like a more generic way, where you can just say, okay, if I'm doing prime number calculation, I can just, if I could do something like this in a request response format, where I request my worker to perform some operation and I get the response back. Similarly, if I request something for other function, I get the response back. In this case, I don't have to put use effect separate and then do something uh, magic for knowing like where it was called, what is the order, and all of those things, right? This would be straightforward. I click something, I get the response back. So um, to solve this, that there is like a RPC pattern, and RPC pattern is basically like a remote procedure communication. What I forgot the full form. RPC, remote procedure call. So this this is basically like a you send some request, and RPC is nothing but just request response protocol, where you send some request and you get the response back, and the request and response are associated. So you know, like if you are getting a response, which request it belong to. So we don't have any specific protocol happening on the worker because we have post message protocol there. So that's why we have to form something by ourselves. And usually how it looks like, our RPC looks like, is basically you send something, send message in this format where you have an ID. It could be any ID. And you send some payload or message. Now, while you are sending back, like from worker, when you're sending the message back, you have to pass the same ID from worker as well, with whatever the response is there. So this ID is an identifier through which you map your request and response. And you can basically know like what a request belongs to. So here, like if you see like the way we have converted it into promise is similar. That whenever we pass a worker, and so basically it returns a passing method. Whenever we do a request, what it does, it creates a new ID. It does like it sends a message with that ID. And it also attach a new listener. In this listener, we are just checking like when I'm getting a message back, if the ID matches, and if the ID matches, then I will resolve my promise. And also like this just to like remove the previous this assigned event, so like you don't end up in memory leak. But yeah, like the idea is simple. You are from worker, you are sending the same ID back, and from that ID you are doing the mapping, and you are knowing like then you are doing the mapping of request and response. So, and that's why you promisify your post messages. Any question on this part? So that there was a, in real app, we work on very less usage of web worker we use. Is it because we don't know the real use fit, or not knowing about the web worker itself? Actually, there are good uses of a web worker. It's just that in most of the application where most of things are happening on the back end, not on front end, you don't need a new worker to initiate, because like instantiating a new worker and then sending a message also comes with some latency. And if, let's say, you are paying 2 milliseconds for sending message to worker and getting the message back, right? And if your actual processing is happening under 2 milliseconds, then you don't need a worker. A worker is only needed when you do some heavy lifting, like heavy lifting in the front end. Image processing is there, or like a file, if you're reading the file, or example, let's say you are doing you have some server type of you are trying to manage a small server in your client side only, where you send some request and based on that you send some response. Those would be a use case for it, where you are processing some data in client, but like normally in most of the application you don't need it. But yeah, in Flipkart I heard like they used it for doing some canvas based processing, or like some image processing, where based on what, like if you select the item color, they apply that color on that particular image. So yeah, if you're doing some processing of a data, then probably you need a worker, otherwise you don't need it. But yeah, this session is more than worker. It's more on the patterns. So yeah. So this is a way you can promissify things, and it works. Just to try it out, this works fine. And the reason we saw like RPC thing, because this pattern is used in Comlink as well. Similar pattern, a little bit different, but yeah, similar pattern. Now, let's go to this. The other thing, before moving to Comlinks, we should also see about proxies, because like internally, Comlink uses a lot of proxies. So what proxies are? So basically proxies is a way where with which you can intercept any operation on an object. So let's say I have an object here where I have some property. And you can say like whenever you're trying to access a property object.a, do something. Maybe you want to send some metrics to your backend, or maybe you want to, while you're setting some information, like let's say object.b equal to 4, then you might want to do some validation. So if you are trying to do that, you can do with the proxies as well. So there are multiple things in proxies, few of which is basically get, where whenever you are trying to access a property, then your get method will be called with what object you are trying to access and what property in that object you are trying to access. Similarly, when you're trying to set, it gives the object, the property name, and what are the value you are trying to set. And apply is basically when you try to call any function. So here, if I'm doing object.sum, so first it will call get to get this property sum, and then when you're calling it, at that point of time, it will call the apply function. So in this syntax, it will call get and apply both. So yeah, like with proxies, you can basically intercept any object. And the good thing about proxies is you don't need an object. Like you can just pass a dummy object here or anything. And in get and set, you can do some your own stuff. Like you can say like always return hello world. Now, if you do object.a, object.b, or anything, you'll get hello world. This will give you error, because like in a get only you give some string and then it can't be called. So yeah, you don't need an actual object. It's just that in proxy you can decide whatever logic you want to run. And Comlink does something similar, like the object is just for defining interface, and just to understand like what property you are accessing, nothing more than that. There is no actual object lying around. So before that, let's just see once about proxies. Okay. So few things which we would be seeing today is like basically the get method, which I mentioned, the set method, the apply method, and also the construct method. So construct method is basically when you call a method. Let's say you have created a proxy, and you are calling, like you are creating a new instance of that property, then your construct callback will be called inside the handler. So, like actually, if you see, like whatever you the operation you can do on an object, all of this has a proxy equivalent, so that you can handle the different type of operations in an object. Any question so far?
Hello.
Yep.
So, is it not possible to do the same like mutate a object without a proxy? So, I'm not that get the point. Why we use proxy?
You can mutate the object with proxy as well. It's just that before mutating, if you want to do some validation, or before getting something, maybe like let's say you want to say you're trying to access a property called object dot money, and this object dot money would return object dot a and plus object dot b. So this is more of a getter type of a pattern, where probably you can do something else as well, like or you can say you're trying to access a property, and maybe you don't have a permission to access that property. You can apply those permission thing as well, based on the user permission or anything. So those are the use case where you can do the proxy thing. You'll understand like the use case of proxy here, on the Comlink. That why those proxies required, but there are multiple uses, like the Comlink uses it like this, and then if you have used emer.js, where you are allowed to do some mutation, and it will create a new this library emer.js. So what it allows you to do, okay, is there? So let's say if you have an object, and if you want to say base state dot zero dot length equal to something, so ideally you are mutating, but it will create a new reference for this array and this object, but it will keep this object untouched. So because like a mutation is a smaller code to do. Otherwise, if you have to do, so you have to spread the array, and then you have to do object dot assign on this rest operator. A lot of you have to do some patterns like this, right? But if you can mutate it, you can just say draft one dot done, and that will work. And internally, they use as proxy to figure out like what path you are trying to mutate, and based on that, they know like, okay, this is the path I'm trying to mutate, and that's the path they have to create a new reference for. So internally, they do the similar thing what you are doing here. It's just that it makes the code simpler. So there are a lot of real world use cases, but like actually, there are a lot of use cases, but mostly on the library level. In application, you don't see a lot of uses of proxies.
Okay, yeah, got it.
So yeah, the proxy and this whole RPC thing is the main crux of Comlink. So that's why I like wanted to touch on both. And by the way, there is one more thing on RPC. Probably I just would like to touch upon that as well. So there is one like a Json Rpc protocol where it is used to communicate between two, like one server and a client, where you can't do this structure cloning type of thing, like where you have to serialize data and pass some data, right? There, if you have to communicate with them, so sometime and this pattern, like this protocol is widely used in your IDs, in this ID, all the LSP like autocompletes you are getting, right? Okay. So all the autocomplete we get here, that is coming from like a LSP server, and the LSP server and this client is communicating through Json Rpc method. So that is also similar. Like you'll have an ID through which you do the request and response mapping, and then if you are calling an object, so you call, if you're calling a method, you give the name of the method, and then you give the params of that method. So in backend, it will have the reference of this method. So based on this, it will know like, okay, I have to call the substrate method with these params. So similarly, like on the response, it will do like, okay, in the client, I have to call the update method with following params. So this is one like another very widely used, like a standard RPC pattern. But yeah, like Comlink has its own RPC pattern. Everything clear on proxies and RPC, right? Because like that would be the heavy part of your Comlink, and yeah, like it's very important to understand that.
What is the use case of Comlink?
Yes, so we'll just first see like what is the use of Comlink. So you have seen the example of this RPC thing, right? Where we are trying to call some method of a web worker, and we are passing like which method to call. So prime and Fibonacci, and then we get the response. So we have created our own RPC pattern. Now with Comlink, and if you see your math worker, it would be like you have a functions, and you are listening on message, and then based on the message type, you are calling a specific function with the payload you are providing. So this is some pattern you're following, right? With Comlink, you can remove all of this boilerplate code. It's not actually boilerplate code, but yeah, you can remove all of those things. So in Comlink, you can just define functions. You can expose those functions, like this method you are exposing. And then in the consumption part, you can just say like, okay, I have the math worker, which is wrapped inside a Comlink. Now I can just do like a math worker dot is prime or math worker dot Fibonacci. So it looks like your whole utilities or like whatever worker has the code, you have brought that code to your main thread, like or any thread, right? So you have moved the process from one realm to another realm without knowing it. So you don't have to do all those on message and everything. You can just call those method directly. It looks very similar to like how do you do ES6 imports and exports, right? So you are exposing something there, and then you can just use whatever you're exposing. You can call those methods directly. And not just method, you can even do something like this, like you can initialize, like if you see the Comlink worker, we have a class definition here. And in the, like with simple pattern, if you try to do this without Comlink, it would be a nightmare. Like you can't expose classes with from web worker to main thread. But with Comlink, it becomes very straightforward. You just create a new instance, and then you can do you can call that call a method of that instance, like you are doing it on a main thread. So even though this some method is on your worker thread, but you can call it like it's present in your own main thread. So that's what the Comlink tried to solve. The one thing you might have noticed that everywhere we have to do await. So basically, like all those access, property access, or like method calls and everything, those are turned into promises. You have seen the RPC pattern, right? In RPC pattern, we turned our post message and on message handler into a request response format. So similarly, Comlink is also doing something where property access is basically a request, and once you access it, it will come as a response to your main thread. Just to see this working, this work, and yeah, like it is happening inside your in your worker thread. So this, yeah, comlink is just for exposing elements. So comlink can work anywhere where you have a post message handlers. It can work with iframe. It can work with WebSockets. It can work with a shared web worker. So anywhere where there is a more post message and message pattern, you can use comlink. But yeah, like the real use case was the web worker. But yeah, like they have a way you can use it anywhere. And I think I don't know why they haven't communicated it as a like you can use it with the iframe as well, because like a iframe this becomes a very tricky task whenever you are communicating with iframes. The post message and on message thing is not very neat. Okay, so yeah, and if we see like if you try to like if you see the whole comlink library, it's a very small library. This is actually around 1.2 KB gzip. So they don't have much code. If you check out the code, right? Like, most of them are like a TypeScript interfaces, but the real code is very small. And basically it is a RPC and proxy wrapper of messages, post messages, and we'll see how. So if you see the comlink, there are two important pieces. One is a wrap and one is expose. So wrap is where basically in your thread you say like I want to wrap port. So basically you wrap a WebSocket port, sorry, web worker port, or any like a message channel port. It could be service worker port. It could be iframe port, message channel port, anything like you can wrap it. And the expose method is what you have seen here, like a you expose methods. So these are the two main parts, and we'll go a little bit deeper on that two methods. So the wrap method, what it does, it actually creates a proxy of a like empty object, and it uses that proxy object to figure out whenever you're trying to access any property, it extract out what path you are trying to extract, like what path you are trying to access, or you're trying to update, or if you're trying to call it, it figures out that path, and then it passes that whole path information to your web worker, and then try to run the same, like try to access the path in actual web worker, and based on the operation, whether it's a get, set, or apply. If it is a get, it will try to access and return you the value. If it is set, it will try to set the value. If it is apply, then it will try to call the value with the arguments you have provided. So to see that, let's put some debugger point and try to see it how it works. Now I have a comlink. So wrap. Let me show the expose function first. Expose. But before that, so and the expose thing, what it does, it basically creates a listener, like it does the port dot add event listener message, and based on the operations you are providing and based on the path you are providing, it tries to apply that on actual object, whatever you are exposing. So we'll see that here. So let's put debugger point and call the spline method. Okay, what happened? Why it is not coming here? Okay. Uh, So in this data, if you see, so it has a ID, which is like that unique ID I told about, which is used to figure out the request, which is used to apply the mapping. Then it has a path on that object. So if you see here in comlink worker, so we are exposing an object. We can store it on a different context, like exposed object. You can expose an object, you can expose a function, anything you can expose here. Here we are just exposing an object. So in this object, what the path is. So the property path is prime, and in that is prime. You are trying to call apply, because you are trying to call that method with argument list of there is a value we are passing. So we'll go on what this type thing is there, but you can see here, right? Like it is converting, like whenever you're trying to access a property, it is converting it into a path, and it is passing that path information to your worker file. Now let's see the proxy. Okay, so let's try to put some points here, point of here, and the apply. Okay. Let me call this again. Why this is not? Okay, not this one. So here, if you see, like on the target is nothing. If you check the target, right, the target object is just like some anonymous function, which doesn't matter. Like this just this is just a dummy object, but this is the main part of it, where based on a prop, it is creating a path information, and that path information, it is passing to your web worker. And so this was prop was is prime method, but it will not come on this condition. It will probably come here because this is not the last method. This is, so it will again go to create proxy and then apply. Now, if you see the path here, the path is prime. Actually, to explain it in a better way, I'll just wrap it inside more complex in another object. And in my math comlink worker, let me do, okay, so math dot what's okay. But anyway, like if you see on the apply function, now the path is complex, so it would be basically object.complex.is prime. Now, once you know this path, you can come back to your worker file, and you can try to access that property, like in this object, object.complex.is prime. This is something you are trying to call, So you can find this function, and then you can pass your arguments, the argument list you are passing from your main thread. So let's check the code as well a little bit. Get proxy. Yeah. So if you see like they have a proxy for set, apply, and constructor. So these are the basically like either you're trying to get the property, set a property, you're trying to call it, or you're trying to initialize a new method. And inside that, like if this is the last operation you are doing, if get is the last operation you are doing, then it is calling the like WebSocket message where it is doing like the port is basically here not WebSocket, web worker. In web worker, you are doing post message with ID and some transfers are there. We'll come into that later. But yeah, like it's trying to promise 5. So if you see, this is a very equivalent to the RPC implementation we did. So it is creating an ID, attaching an event listener. In an event listener, they are looking that whether this ID is, there is a match on the ID. And if there is a match, then they resolve it. And after listening into that, they are basically doing the post message. So yeah, if access is the last access, then they will directly call the request method. And how they know like it's a last property, because like you are doing await, right? So basically whenever you are doing await, it is basically like you are trying to access .then property. So whenever you're trying to access .then property, and this could be a bug as well, if let's say in middle, if you have some then manually defined then method, so they are assuming like, okay, the last promise, because you are doing await, you can rely on that. So whenever it is a last property, you call your WebSocket with a path and with the value. And if you're trying to set, you will pass like the value, a path, and a message, like the type of operation you are doing. So here you are doing message.set. In this, you are trying to do message.get. Like so in apply, this would be basically like you're calling with message.apply. You have path information, and you have all the argument list, whatever argument is required. So whatever the last operation you are doing on that particular object, it extract path information, argument, whatever things are required, and pass those information. This part is clear, right? And let's see wrap as well. Wrap function, wrap, not wrap, expose. Yeah. In expose, as I mentioned, right? In expose, nothing special happening. It is just like a whatever worker is there. So it is attaching a event listener on that, and based on whatever message you are passing, it is figuring out what type of message it is, whether it's a get. So it will figure out like what is the parent object for it. So when we try to access is prime, the parent object would be complex object, and in that complex object, it will try to access that particular like a particular property. If it is a get, it will just return that value. If it is a set, then it will try to set that particular value in parent that property path. If it is apply, then it will on that like last value, it will try to call that function with the argument list. Any questions so far?
So Susan, so I just wondering whether they they are mentioning the variable names like endpoint and likewise. So internally, whether they are creating a server and exposing data to through endpoint, like that way they are maintaining.
So the server is nothing but a worker file, and this worker, they don't have to mention any object. You are just telling that you are exposing an object, and this object will not be accessed until you try to access it on your main thread. And whenever you try to access any property in your main thread, that at that point of time, they don't know, like in main thread, they don't know the structure of this thing. So they don't have any information about it. In the main thread, only thing they are doing is translating the access. Like if I, let me close all the questions. Whenever you're trying to do something like this, mathworker.complex, so they don't know whether this property exists or not. Neither they know like this is prime exist or not. They're just like whenever you're accessing, because this is a proxy, they can know like what property you're trying to access. So when you're trying to access property complex, they will push that property in an array, and it will again return a new proxy. In that proxy, you're trying to access prime, so it will add that on array. So they will create a path array, and once the path array is created, they will pass it to the worker file. And once it is in worker, it will at that point of time, they will try to access this object based on the path you are passing. So if you have used a lotus, this thing, right? Lotus set and get. So it works something similar, where you provide a path and you try to get a value.
Okay.
So that's a interesting thing happening here. The actual objects are not going here and there. It's just that proxy is sending the information, your intent of what you're trying to do, and that intent is shared. And based on that intent, you are applying that intent on your other thread, and you are replying back based on whatever you are doing. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Now this wrap and expose thing works fine for objects like this, but you can have a pattern where let's say instead of getting the value here, you're passing a callback. And you're saying like, I want to receive the response in the callback. Oh man. Right. Now, normal objects are like structure clonable. So if you see the list, you can clone arrays, objects, maps, all of those things. But there are certain type of objects which you can't clone. Basically, event or a DOM element. Message ports are transferable. This is not clonable. Request response or like readable string. The reason why these are not clonable, unit array can be cloned, but not the readable string. So the reason they can't be cloned is basically like it can have function. Let's say take an example of a function, right? Callback. Now in this callback, you can access some random variable, const b equal to 2. Now here you're trying to log that b. Now This one, it can't structure clone and send it to your worker, because like even though it's an argument, you can't pass it. The only reason is because it depends on some scope, and uh, you, on the worker realm, you don't have those scopes. So that's why this is not clonable. Now, how to solve this particular problem? So they use a similar pattern like what they do for normal object access, right? They try to handle it similar for callbacks as well. But before that, they provide certain APIs. Let's look into those APIs, and then we will see like how the callbacks are transformed. So as I mentioned, like not all objects can be structured, cloned, or neither they are transferable. So to solve that purpose, Comlink provide a transfer handler method. And in transfer handler, let's say if you have an event type, right? You can say like how you want to serialize it. Probably you don't want to pass whole object. You just want to pass the ID of that element and class list of that element. Maybe let's say event position. So page X and page Y thing, right? You might need only certain set of thing on your web worker. So this provide a way where you can define a custom handler where you serialize the information, and the serialization will happen in your main thread. So here, when I'm saying main thread and worker thread, basically the sending thread, because the same thing can happen on from worker thread to main thread. So if worker thread is calling this method, then the serialize is happening there. Like if you're trying to pass any callback from worker to main thread, the serialize will happen there. But yeah, in this case, serialize will happen on main thread, and then deserialize will happen on the worker thread. So you have to provide this function, like this handler, on both main thread and the worker thread, and they are handled by event type, means the handler type. So you have to give some unique identifier for it, and based on that they identify like a whether a particular handler, what type of handler is. And also like they provide this can handle method. So it passes the object, and you check. We'll see that example. Now, before trying to pass any data from one thread to another thread, Comlink does this. Let me actually show on the code. Value. Yeah. So it loops on all the transfer handlers you have provided, and there are a few defaults transfer handler. It loops into that and check whether the value you are passing, it has to be handled. And if it has to be handled, it will try to serialize it, and it will pass a new information, which is like a with what type of handler you have serialized this, what is the serialized value. And if it returns any transferables, it will pass that as well. But yeah, like you can provide your own transfer handlers, but internally it uses the same thing for callback. We'll see how. The second thing is we would like to understand is message channels. How many of you know message channels? And this is also not very used syntax, but so message channel is basically creating a channel. So you can think it as a pipe, and pipe has a two input and output type of thing, right? Two ports. You can consider two ports. So, and you can pass one information from one port to another port, and both port can one port can stay in one thread, the another port can stay on the another thread. So that's why that's how you can communicate between two different processes, not just thread. This can be used for iframes. This can be used for in any inter-process communication. So in Node.js, you can, if you're creating a child process, you can use message channel. Even within same thread, you can use it. Like there are few hacks which for scheduling techniques people use message channel. Like React internally uses message channel. In Brahmos, I used message channel. So there are certain hacks where message channel is used, but not much used. So, but if you what it is just a channel with two different port, and you can pass port from one process to another process, and then the process can pass information through that port, and they can pass information based on what type of process it is. So basically for web worker, it will pass like it will do the structure cloning, but for this thing, it will not do the structure cloning. For iframe, I think in iframe structure cloning doesn't happen. Their serialization happen. So depending on, or I might be wrong, need to check that. Yeah, so you can pass ports around. Now, how Comlink uses this two pattern is basically like they create a proxy transfer handler. Now, this will look little a bit like an inception. So feel free to interrupt me and ask questions here. So when you are passing a callback like this, right? Let me go back to this example. Yeah. You can't pass this object. So basically you do comlink dot proxy. And this proxy will not do anything here. It will just mark this function to be handled by proxy handler. Like, let me show that method as well. Proxy. So it will just mark, like it will attach a key symbol, the proxy marker, so that like whenever you call this method can handle, it will say, okay, I can handle this. I should handle this data. And internally, what it does is that it will create a message channel on the serialize, and it will return a port. And this is like a so message ports are transferable objects, right? So in a transferable objects, I told that you have to pass the actual data, and you have to pass the transferable object on, like, transferable piece on that. So in message port, the port itself is a transferable piece. So you have to pass that as a transferable object. And on the deserialize, okay, so let me explain it from here. So in proxy transfer handler, what it does, like in a serialize, whatever object you're passing. So in our case, we are passing a callback. It will expose that callback from main thread to worker thread. So like how we are exposing the object from worker thread to main thread, similarly, now main thread is exposing object from main thread to worker thread. So it will call the expose on whatever object you're passing, and that object would be your callback. And it will start listening to this port. So in our expose method, we saw, right, like it will just attach a event listener, and based on whatever you're passing it, it will try to apply those things. And in the worker thread, it will deserialize it. And in the deserialize, what it is doing, it will wrap that particular port, and wrap the port means it will create a proxy for your callback. So now if you're trying to call the callback from your worker file, let's say if I'm doing something like this, in my fibnox is prime method, we are passing some callback, right? And in this callback, I am calling callback true, or let's say prime. Now what it will do, this callback is basically the proxy object, the proxy object we saw earlier. Now, when you're accessing this proxy object, it will see like, okay, it is trying to call this method. So it will do a apply operation, and it is passing an argument, which is a prime. So this will trigger the same way you were triggering from main thread to worker thread. Now it is triggering from worker thread to main thread. So it is calling a proxy for an object which is present on the main thread, and it is passing some argument there. So here it will just translate to object called type apply. Path would be your callback. It internally creates a different way, but just to simplify, it will be array of path. And then it will pass the arguments. So this object will be posted from your message channel. So here you are creating a message channel, right? And you have provided one port. You have passed this one port to your worker thread. So in that port, basically the wrap method, what it is doing, like if you're trying to call the callback, it will pass that information, this whole object, through that port, the message channel port we have created. And in the expose method, because it is listening for this like a channel port, because we are listening to the message channel port, it will listen that method, and it based on what property we are trying to access, it will call that. Actually, let's try it. Let's debug it so it will be more clear. Proxy console.log. Fine. Did I confuse you people? Like this is a little bit inception, and it can happen proxy inside proxy inside proxy. So if you're calling, if in this callback I'm calling the callback again of the main thread, let's say I'm doing something like this dot prime or any other method, then it will again create the proxy. So this can have like that inception thing can happen. Now prime. Okay, and here, let me add the whole event. So yeah, this is where it is called apply with the argument truths. Now from here, you will see like it will go to, what is my file? Main. So we don't have any path because like the callback is directly, it's we are not accessing any property, so it just directly calling the callback. So we don't have any path, but we have the argument and we have a type apply. So now this message is coming from your worker thread. If you see the stack trace here, this is coming from, this is comlink. Yeah. So this is coming from callback, like our worker file is calling is trying to call a method on the main thread, and the way they are communicating is just the same way, like they are passing the path and whatever argument you are trying to access. So if you play again, it will come to this one, and it is passing that object. So Boolean is a structure clonable, so it will just clone it and it will pass it and it will call the callback. This is clear. Any question on this? Also, let me know if this was confusing, but yeah, any question on that particular thing? Okay. So in a nutshell, if you think any object or functions are being transferred from one thread to another thread, they are not actually transferred. The proxy is trying to behave like the object is present in the other thread as well. And on the runtime, it is trying to figure out like what you're trying to access, and it sends that intention to the other thread, whether it's from worker thread to main thread or main thread to worker thread. So the only thing is happening that way. Now it applies, the callbacks are handled in that way. The errors, for error also, it has its own custom handler. If you see, like transfer handlers, through transfer handler, because error object also can't be structure clone. The reason for that is the stack trace doesn't make sense. Like the error has a context, right? In which stack it has been thrown, and you can actually click on that and you can go on that file. So that can't be directly shared. So that's why what they do, like the whole error object can't be structure clone. So that's why what they do, if the object is a type of error and it has a throw marker, so in any error object they apply this throw marker. They create a custom serialized object for it, where there is a is error, and they are passing the message, the type of handler, the error handler basically, and the stack of it. And on the other end, they are doing the deserialize, and the deserialize, what they are doing, like they are creating a new error object, and whatever properties you are passing there, which would be message and stack, they are overriding those values. So the object.assign will do that. So basically, like whenever a worker thread is giving any error, they will capture it, and then after capturing it, they have a try catch block on this thing. If you see, like in expose method, in try catch block, or they are just doing like a return value, and they are attaching a throw marker. And based on this throw marker, they are passing this throw, like they are serializing it. And then on the main thread, they are deserializing it back into actual error. So yeah, and there is one last thing. I think that would cover the whole Comlink thing. There are a few small utilities, but we don't have to go on all of that. To understand like how the transferable object works with this. So similarly, like the transferable objects require you providing the transferable part of it. This is your unit array, but the actual transferable part is the buffer. So you have to specifically specify that thing. So what they do, like you convert your normal data and you define like what are the transferable objects. So it will internally keep it on a cache. So it will internally keep the value in a cache, and during wiring this information, they figure out like if transferable handle. So to get that array, like the transferable array, they get that information back from there. So basically, like on your code, it looks like you are just passing you're just passing an data, but internally it also takes care of passing all the transferable objects. The reason why they have provided this utility is basically like, let's say you have multiple places. Now you're calling this method again, some function with some other thing. So it could have a multiple, you can provide a multiple array, but at the end they have to be flattened together to be passed on like one single post message. So that's why like they maintain that cache type of information. Yeah, I'll open up for questions because like the Comlink is only that much. This is basically like the proxy and RPC pattern. Any questions, folks? No? Okay, let me stop recording.